Hello, students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to an audio-visual lecture involving the diathesis-stress model. So basically, what we're going to do is discuss some different models of how the genes and environment interact to produce disorders and problems, for example. So the first one we're going to look at here, the diathesis-stress model. By the way, that basically means diathesis, condition making one susceptible to developing a disorder is what we mean by that. So this is called the diathesis-stress model. And so basically what this model purports is that genes are activated under certain environmental conditions or events. For example, stress would be the classic example of that, where you've inherited a condition and certain environmental variables have to be present to sort of activate it or to get you to that point where you're actually impaired and are struggling with a disorder. So thus, we inherit certain behavioral tendencies through our genes, which are then activated under certain conditions. So if you remember the example of Janelle that we've been discussing in the textbook, so Janelle was the one that would faint at the sight of blood. So you could argue that Janelle inherited the tendency to faint at the sight of blood, but certain things would trigger that reaction. So, for example, if she was witnessing a dissection in anatomy class, for example, it may have triggered her gene or been enough to sort of push her over the edge where she's showing those problems. So, thus, you could argue that a person may be vulnerable due to genetics, and certain environmental conditions may be enough to sort of accumulate the problem to the point where they become impaired and it's an issue. Thus, you could argue that someone with a large diathesis would only need a small amount of stress, for example, for the disorder to actually develop, compared to someone who's inherited a smaller diathesis. Okay, so the book is a kind of an interesting example of this or a way of looking at this. So I'm going to go to this next slide. And if you're more a visual person, I think this will help you. So we're going to look over here on the left to this cup with a liquid in it. And I want you to imagine that this red line at the top is the point at which the person develops a disorder, or they actually are showing the disorder, okay? And so this is made up of several factors, including their genetic vulnerability, and then environmental stressors, for example. So those would accumulate to get them to get the level, if you would, up to this red line where they have a problem. So in this case, this person's inherited quite a bit of genetic vulnerability, but they've also experienced quite a bit of life stressors, and so the accumulation of that has led them for their level to rise, if you would, to get to that point where they have a disorder. So theoretically, what they're saying is that, well, if you inherited less vulnerability, it would take more stress to get you to that point where you're actually showing the disorder. So if we look over here on the right, and they use the example of alcoholism. So we have two people here. Person one is the one that becomes an alcoholic, and person two actually doesn't become an alcoholic. So on the left here, person number one, they've inherited a large tendency to become an alcoholic. So through their genes, if you would, they've inherited a substantial amount of that disorder at this point, and therefore they went through some life stressors, excuse me, and that helped it to accumulate up to this line. You can see that they actually became an alcoholic. Whereas this person on the right, let's say they had the exact same life experiences, but they only inherited a very small amount or tendency to become an alcoholic, they would not show alcoholism. In other words, what it's saying is that person two would need much more life events or stressors, if you would, to actually get to that level. So depending on how much you inherit, that would sort of translate into how much life stress you would have to experience to get to the point where it would actually become a full-blown disorder, impairment, and problem. Okay? So it's pretty clear cut and understandable how they explain this. I mean, I understand that, but a lot of the critics believe that they've completely oversimplified how we think about disorders. In other words, it makes sense, but it's really simplistic in nature. So we're going to look at a study that shows that it's way more complex than just looking at it in these sort of terms. So in this study that's cited in the textbook, but we're going to look at, it was conducted in New Zealand in 2003 by Caspi and others. And basically, they followed subjects for 20 years, starting at age 3 to 26, and they recorded the amount of stress in their life, as well as if they became depressed. So in this particular study, they look at depression in connection to life stressors. Now, it's important to understand that they looked at the genetics of this and they identified different alleles in connection to something called serotonin. Serotonin, a neurotransmitter, which is covered in this chapter, but long and short of it is that it's related to depression. So this particular allele comes in some different versions. Let's take a look here. So we have the SS condition, which means the person has inherited two short alleles, whereas SL is one short and one long. And then, of course, LL is two long alleles. Excuse me. So in this study, they hypothesized that people under the LL condition would cope better with stress compared to the SS group and thus less likely to become depressed. So that was what was thought at the beginning of the study, but they found it was much more complicated to that. So complicated. So if we look at the graph of the data here, you can see the different markers there. So on the left, we have probability of major depression episode. And then at the bottom, we have maltreatment, if you would. So this graph is showing the probability of a depressive episode and the incidence of maltreatment in the subjects' lives. They found that people with the SS condition had a greater risk of depression compared to the LL group, especially if they had at least 4 stressful life events. So they determined that in the study that 4 stressful events seemed to be the critical factor. They also looked at their childhood and compared the groups. So childhood maltreatment was more of a factor for the SS group in terms of becoming depressed as adults. It doubled their risk of depression compared to the LL group, and you can see that visually in the data there. For the LL group, stressful childhood did not affect the incidence of depression in adulthood. And furthermore, approximately 30% became depressed whether or not they had childhood stress. So you can see this LL group here. So they found that about 30% of them would become depressed regardless if they had a stressful life event or not. So thus theoretically what they kind of reasoned here is that the stress may be more related to a recent event compared to childhood, because remember they followed them for 20 years, but they also have data that's more recent in their life. So in other words, they may have just gone through something like a recent stressful event. So they found that, it's not necessarily something that would be deeply rooted in childhood that's accumulated over time, that it may have been something more recent. So the point of the study, even though it's kind of complex here, it shows that the genes and environment do interact to produce differences. That's clear in the data, but both do not solely explain the onset of a disorder. Rather, it takes a complex interaction of the two. So even though the diathesis-stress model makes sense, I guess the point is that it's way more complicated than just sort of looking at it, those basic values. There's a lot of moving parts to kind of consider, and we see different outcomes depending on different cases. So it's obviously very complex in some cases. All right, so please go on to the next step in the class.